Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. One thing about Americans, they love Australia. Most Americans have never been there. It's an awful long way away, but when Americans think of Australians, they imagine a freer, tougher version of themselves. Steve Irwin, Crocodile Dundee, that kind of thing. So there's a huge reserve of affection in the United States for Australia, its culture, and its people. It's also possible that most Americans, us included, have not updated our assumptions about Australia in a while, and the modern reality is a little different from what we imagine. Case in point, 2 years ago, June 2019, the federal police in Sydney raided the offices of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, that's the state broadcaster, ABC. They weren't at all unclear about why they were raiding the offices. They said it out loud. Just days before the raid, ABC broadcast allegations from a whistleblower that embarrassed the government of Australia. This whistleblower said that Australia's military leaders had killed civilians in Afghanistan, including children, and had lied about it. The ABC broadcast that story. It wasn't a crime to broadcast the story, and Australia's federal police didn't pretend it was. Instead, they served the broadcaster with a warrant that authorized them, the police, to cover up any evidence of the Australian military's misconduct. Think about that for a minute. The warrant, and we're quoting it, allowed police to, quote, add, copy, delete, or alter any material they wanted to alter on the broadcaster's computer. That's not the kind of thing that happens in a free country, to put it mildly. And yet Australia's military and police forces never suffered any consequences for doing it. In fact, many Australians, the polls show, supported it. They rewarded their military with hundreds of millions of dollars in new spending. Most of that money was intended to keep Australians safe from the malign influence of Chinese authoritarianism, even though that seemed a lot like Chinese authoritarianism itself. 2 years later, what does Australia look like? Well, it looks a lot like China did at the beginning of the pandemic. That's the sad truth. We showed you those pictures from China at the time. People being welded inside their apartments to starve. The guys in hazmat suits forcing people into quarantine boxes and then driving away to some unknown destination. At the time, our public health officials, including Tony Fauci, told us that nothing like that could ever happen in our country or in the West. But that was wrong, because those things are now happening in Australia. This is what happens in Australia, for example, if you try to leave your apartment.
Anthony Karam knows he is COVID positive when he steps into this public lift. Already breaking so many rules, he doesn't bother to cover his mouth as he sneezes and splutters. The 27-year-old is still infectious but has gone missing from his Wentworth Point apartment. A warrant now issued for his arrest.
This 27-year-old chap, who apparently has expressed the view that he doesn't care less whether he spreads the virus, is one example of the worst of the worst.
So a national manhunt for a man who sneezed in an elevator. That's the state of play in modern-day Australia. Not everyone in the country is on board with this, but since Australians were completely disarmed by their government several years ago, there's precisely nothing they can do about it, so it's accelerated. Look at what's happening now. They're being crushed. This was the scene in Melbourne, the second most populous city in the country, in the past month. Watch.
Why are you hitting him, you We're trying to get through. We're trying to go home. We're trying to go home. We're trying to go home.
The government cracking down on Islamic extremists, dangerous revolutionaries in their midst? No, just ordinary Australians complaining, demonstrating peacefully against the lockdowns, beaten by police. There's a lot of footage like this from Australia, and in a moment we'll show you more. But something that's not immediately obvious from the American vantage is that this isn't all of Australia. The whole country is not locked down. In Australia, most of the lockdowns are in the eastern part of the country. That's where the capital of the country is. That's where the federal government has the most control. The western part, the less populated part of Australia, meanwhile, which is home to most of the country's natural resources, isn't locked down at all. 50,000 fans just crowded inside a stadium for a rugby match in Perth, the capital of Western Australia. No one was beaten with nightsticks or hosed by the police. The rugby match was not a super spreader event. Western Australia has had virtually no cases of COVID. How does that happen? How does Western Australia not lock down but remain virtually COVID-free? Simple, by controlling its borders. Western Australia did not let thousands of people stream in from anywhere they wanted to in the world. They're not Texas. They didn't care about protecting their borders. They weren't worried about being called racist. It seemed common sense, and it worked. And here's the revealing thing. In Australia, the federal government is angry that Western Australia has closed its borders. They want that part of the country to open those borders. Really? Why would that be? Well, according to ABC News, Australia's government is, quote, arguing that Western Australia's internal border restrictions are a drag on the national economy, end quote. Well, that's kind of interesting, because the problem with Australia's economy right now does not come from Western Australia closing its borders. It comes from the lockdowns. Those are the biggest drag on the national economy ever conceived in Australia. So are those police SWAT teams beating people for going outside. COVID mandates are a far greater threat to Australia's economy and its social fabric than COVID itself. Here's the health minister of Queensland in Eastern Australia explaining that outdoor mask mandates are absolutely necessary because of 2 new COVID cases. That's 2, not 200,000 or 2,000, but 2. Watch.
What these 2 new cases mean is that we will be extending immediately the directive in relation to mask wearing to the Gold Coast.
Okay, so we want to pause for a minute to give you a sense of the scope of the pandemic in Australia. To date, COVID has caused 1,300, quote, recorded deaths in the entire country. Australia has 25 million people. Now, that 1,300 figure includes people who, quote, died with probable COVID. What does that mean? We have no idea. No one's ever defined it. In Alberta, Canada, and this might tell you something, the health minister just announced that anyone who stays home from any illness will be counted by the Canadian government as a COVID patient. Then she pretended she didn't say that because it's obviously insane, but it's on video, so we know that she did. In Australia, the government has adopted a similar standard. Anyone who leaves home apparently is also being counted as a COVID patient. Here's a man in Melbourne this Sunday who made the mistake of walking a block from his house.
He lives a block away.
Yeah, but he has no
so what do you mean?
He has no reason to be here. He doesn't have a valid reason to be out today. He wasn't wearing a face mask.
Hold on, he has a face mask in his pocket. He was just smoking a cigarette. He just came to get lunch with me.
And the reason I didn't have a mask on because I was having a cigarette. I've got 2 masks in my pocket. Like, what else do you want me to do?
Here's the interesting thing. That's obvious authoritarianism. It's terrifying that that could happen in a civilized English-speaking country, in Australia, of all places. But you'll notice the police never ask the man if he's been vaccinated. You'd think that'd be the first question you'd ask, because vaccination works, doesn't it? That's why it's mandatory, right? That's an important point because publicly, Australia's leaders are still pretending that vaccination status matters. In New South Wales, again in Eastern Australia, one official promised that the unvaccinated will be allowed to retain their freedoms.
The message to the unvaccinated is that you will not achieve any further freedom unless you get vaccinated. And a further and final message to regional New South Wales. There will be individuals in regional rural New South Wales who choose not to be vaccinated who will lose their freedoms on the 11th of October.
No more freedom if you don't get the vax. But they will arrest you for being outside smoking a cigarette a block from your home without a mask and not even ask you whether you've been vaccinated. So if vaccination status is that important as a health matter, wouldn't that be the first question you ask? But they didn't even bother. Meanwhile, in the same Australian state, New South Wales, officials are telling people that whether they are vaccinated or not, they're not allowed to go to church.
In the name of Jesus, lockdowns are over in the cities of New South Wales.
It's unclear what passage this pastor is preaching from, but it's not the public health order. His church, the Christ Embassy in Blacktown, is in lockdown. hard lockdown. There was no QR code on the door, costing the organisation $5,000. Each of the 30 adult worshippers fined $1,000.
Whether it's a soccer match, whether it's a church service, it doesn't matter. You cannot gather as they did at Blacktown.
Oh, so you have to get vaccinated to have any of your freedoms, but even if you are vaccinated, you're not allowed to go to church. So what is the point of vaccination? Why did the federal government in Australia lock everybody down if there's no actual way to stop the lockdowns? And more to the point, why do they want open borders in Western Australia if closing the borders actually has kept the population safe? Well, they want open borders there for the same reason they want it here. In New South Wales, one official, the state's health officer, explained it out loud. Watch.
We will be looking at what contact tracing looks like in the New World Order. Yes, it will be pubs and clubs and other things if we have a positive case there.
The New World Order. She said it out loud. This is a really interesting story, what's happening in Australia and what it means for the rest of the Anglosphere, very much including us. And maybe that's why globally most media organizations have refused to cover it. That comment, the one you just saw about the New World Order, got barely any coverage at all. In fact, all the footage we showed you today is mostly being ignored in the United States. Why? Because it's possible what's happening in Australia might be instructive to us in the United States. In just 2 years, the Australian police went from raiding newsrooms to beating people in the streets. So maybe the lesson is things can change very quickly. One moment, the English-speaking world is mocking China for being dystopian and autocratic. The next moment, they're aping China and hunting people down who are 2 blocks from their own homes and smoking a cigarette.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.